On December 16, 1944, General Heinrich Freiherr von Lüttwitz sent his armies into the Ardennes and believed, with the professional confidence of a man who had commanded armor on the Eastern Front, that he understood exactly what would happen next. 25 German divisions would crash through the thin American line in the Belgian forest, drive west to the Meuse River, turn north, and capture Antwerp. Von Lüttwitz's 47th Panzer Corps would take the road junction at Bastogne, 7 roads converging at a single town in the Ardennes highlands, and drive west before the Americans could recover. The attack achieved complete surprise. By December 20th, von Lüttwitz's forces had surrounded Bastogne, trapping the American 101st Airborne Division with dwindling ammunition and no air resupply in the low clouds. Von Lüttwitz sent a formal written ultimatum demanding surrender. The American commander, Brigadier General McAuliffe, sent back one word: nuts. Von Lüttwitz understood professional military language. He did not understand nuts. His officers had to explain it was a refusal. He was furious. He had the 101st surrounded. He had superior numbers. The correct response, in every military tradition he had been trained in, was to recognize the position was hopeless and accept the terms. The Americans were not behaving correctly. This was not the first time von Lüttwitz had noticed Americans behaving incorrectly. In August, commanding the 2nd Panzer Division in Normandy, he had watched Patton's Third Army drive through Brittany on a corridor so narrow that German headquarters identified it as a fatal overextension. It was not an overextension. It was doctrine. Patton's doctrine. Speed was not a tactical advantage. Speed was a weapon. The faster you moved, the less time the enemy had to think. An enemy who could not think could not fight. Von Lüttwitz did not yet know what was coming from the south. He was about to find out. German General Erich Brandenberger, commanding the southern flank of the Ardennes offensive, expected Patton to react. He assumed it would take at least 4 days to wheel Patton's divisions from their eastward orientation and turn them north toward Belgium. 4 days. 100,000 men, thousands of vehicles, artillery, and supply columns, moving in one direction, suddenly ordered to move in a completely different direction in the worst winter in 50 years. 4 days was not reckless optimism. It was the conservative estimate of a professional who understood what large formations could and could not do. Patton did it in 48 hours. Brandenberger had been measuring Patton with the wrong ruler. In Nancy, France, a 59-year-old American general was looking at a map of the Ardennes and feeling something his colleagues would later describe as inappropriate enthusiasm. Patton had known the attack was coming, not from intercepts and aerial reconnaissance, from the pattern, the logic, the specific question of what a desperate enemy with dwindling resources would do when it needed one final gamble. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oskar Koch, had been tracking unusual German radio traffic and supply movements since late November. On December 9th, a week before the attack, Koch briefed Patton. The Germans were massing in exactly the sector that Allied High Command had decided was too difficult for a major offensive. Patton listened and ordered his staff to begin preparing contingency plans, not for defense, for counterattack. 3 plans, 3 codenames, 3 axes of advance. Routes mapped, supply lines plotted, artillery positions identified. His staff thought this was excessive. Patton thought it was the minimum preparation for a man who intended to move faster than the enemy expected. On December 16th, when the German attack hit, Patton was ready. "Brad," he said to Bradley at Verdun, pointing to the bulge on the map. The Kraut stuck his head in a meat grinder. He turned his fist in a grinding motion, and this time I've got hold of the handle. He was not being theatrical. He had already phoned his headquarters before leaving for the meeting. The code word was, play ball. The army was already moving. The Verdun conference room on December 19th, 1944, contained most of the senior American command in Europe. The situation maps showed German forces advancing rapidly, a bulge of enemy territory pushing west into Belgium at a speed that had caught the Allied command completely off guard. Eisenhower, characteristically, was trying to find the opportunity in the disaster. "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us," he told the room, "and not of disaster." He wanted a counterattack into the southern flank of the German advance. He looked at Patton. How long would it take to turn the Third Army? The Third Army was currently oriented east, attacking toward Germany. Turning it north meant reversing 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles across icy roads in the worst winter in 50 years, and launching a major offensive in a completely new direction. Patton said 48 hours. The room was quiet. Eisenhower thought Patton was joking. Bradley thought he was being reckless. The other officers looked at each other with the expression of men who have heard something that violates their understanding of what is physically possible. 48 hours. 133,000 vehicles. Ice, snow, roads clogged with retreating American units. 150 miles between Patton's lead tanks and Bastogne. "Don't be fatuous, George," Eisenhower said. Patton was not being fatuous. He had already called his headquarters before leaving for Verdun and given the code word. Play ball. 3 contingency plans, prepared the previous week, were already in motion. The 4th Armored Division was on the road north. The 81st and 26th Infantry Divisions were moving. Routes mapped, supply lines plotted, artillery positions identified. What looked to the room like an impossibly optimistic promise was, in Patton's mind, already an accomplished administrative fact. The planning had been done. The orders existed. All that remained was execution. The German doctrine von Lüttwitz had been trained in required the plan to be made before execution could begin. A new mission meant time for planning, time for coordination. This was not inefficiency, it was professional thoroughness. Patton had removed this step. The contingency plans existed because Patton had ordered them prepared before anyone knew they would be needed. The Third Army moved in 48 hours not because Patton was gifted at improvisation, but because he had already done the planning, already mapped the routes. When the moment came, there was nothing to plan. There was only execution. Brandenberger had assumed Patton would need 4 days. 4 days was the correct estimate for a general who received new orders and then began to plan. Patton had received the new orders a week ago, before anyone else knew they would be needed. The 4 days Brandenberger had counted on had already been spent. Eisenhower looked at the map. He looked at Patton. "George, I didn't think the situation was as bad as this." "It's not bad," Patton said. "It's an opportunity." This exchange captured the difference between the two men. Eisenhower's instinct was to stabilize, shore up the line, prevent further deterioration. Patton's instinct, confronted with catastrophe, was to attack. Not out of recklessness, out of a specific belief about what catastrophe actually was. In Patton's view, a German army that had left its fortifications and was moving in open terrain was not a catastrophe. It was a target. The catastrophe would come later, if the Germans were allowed to consolidate and dig in. The catastrophe was what happened if you waited. This was the philosophical core of everything Patton did, the thing German commanders could not model or predict. He was not trying to be unpredictable. He was trying to be fast. Fast enough that the enemy never had time to make the decisions that would make him hard to beat. He left the conference room at 9:15. By evening, his lead divisions were 50 miles north of where they had been that morning. In his pocket was the code card with 3 contingency plans. He had needed only one. Nickel, north from Ardennes to Bastogne, the fastest route. Von Lüttwitz did not know about the Verdun conference. He did not know the army he expected to spend 4 days turning had already turned. He was still waiting for nuts to mean something different. Patton had already done what he assumed he hadn't started. The idea had started in Mexico in 1916 with 3 automobiles and 10 men. George Patton was 30 years old, a cavalry lieutenant on Pershing's staff, assigned to a punitive expedition that was supposed to catch Pancho Villa and hadn't. He had gone to Mexico because he had argued his way onto Pershing's staff despite being told he was not needed, which was a preview of everything that would follow. He had seen the cavalry charges. He had understood, watching horses against terrain and time and distance, that the cavalry's purpose, to move faster than the enemy expected, to strike before the enemy could prepare, did not require horses. It required speed. It required the willingness to go somewhere the enemy did not expect, before the enemy could get there first. In May 1916, Patton loaded 10 soldiers into 3 automobiles and drove to a ranch where one of Villa's officers was believed to be hiding. They arrived before anyone had been warned. The officer was there. A firefight. The officer was killed. Patton had the body strapped to the hood of his car and drove it back to headquarters. It was the first motorized attack in the history of the United States Army. Pershing called it bold. The newspapers called it dramatic. Patton called it cavalry. He meant something specific by this. Not the sentiment, not the romance of horsemen and sabers that he genuinely loved. The principle. Cavalry existed to do one thing: arrive somewhere unexpected faster than the enemy could respond. The horse was just the mechanism. In 1916, the automobile was faster. In 1918, the tank would be faster still. When the United States entered the First World War, Patton talked his way into command of the new American Tank Corps. He had no experience with tanks. Nobody had experience with tanks in 1917. The weapon had existed for less than 2 years. Patton went to France, studied the French and British tank doctrine, ran the American Tank School at Bourg, and developed a curriculum built around one principle he had brought from cavalry. Speed was the point. Not firepower, not armor, speed. He chose the French Renault FT-17 for training because it was more mobile than the alternatives. He trained his tankers to move, to exploit, to push through gaps before the enemy could close them. The tank, in Patton's doctrine, was not a moving fortress. It was a cavalry charge with armor plating. He commanded the 304th Tank Brigade at Saint-Mihiel in September 1918. Led them on foot when the terrain was too rough for the vehicles. Was wounded at Chepy at the start of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, shot through the thigh, dragged to a shell crater by his orderly, continued to give orders from the crater for an hour before being evacuated. He left the war with a specific conviction that he spent the next 26 years trying to implement. Speed, aggression, and offensive momentum would define future battlefields. Not defensive lines, not attritional warfare, not the careful, methodical advance that had characterized 4 years of trench fighting and produced millions of casualties for minimal territorial gain. The future of war was movement. The unit that moved faster than the enemy expected, that struck before defenses could be organized, that kept moving before counterattacks could be assembled. That unit won. The German army of 1939 had reached the same conclusion. Their doctrine, Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was built on the same principle. Armor and air power and infantry working together, moving faster than the enemy's decision cycle, striking before defenders could respond. In Poland in 1939, in France in 1940, the German panzer divisions had demonstrated that the principle worked. What the German doctrine had not anticipated was an opponent who had built his entire career around the same idea and had had 26 years to think about how to do it faster. Grab them by the nose, Patton said, describing his tactical philosophy, and kick 'em in the pants. The nose was firepower. Fix the enemy's attention, force him to respond to the direct threat. The pants was the flanking movement, the unexpected axis, the thrust that arrived before the enemy could reposition. The critical word was kick. Not nudge, not probe. Kick. Hard, fast, without hesitation, before the enemy recovered from the surprise of the nose. Von Lüttwitz, on December 22nd, was very focused on the nose. He did not see the kick coming. The German generals who faced Patton in 1944 had a specific problem with him that they could not articulate precisely until after the war. He was not unpredictable in the way an incompetent is unpredictable. He was unpredictable in the way a very fast opponent is unpredictable. By the time you had identified what he was doing, he had already done it and was doing something else. German doctrine was built around a specific model of how military operations worked. An attack was identified. The defending commander assessed the threat. Options were evaluated. A decision was made. Orders were issued. Units moved. In a well-trained German staff, this took hours, sometimes a day. Not slowness. The minimum time that professional military decision-making required. Patton had spent 20 years thinking about this sequence and trying to break it. Not by moving faster in the conventional sense, by moving before the sequence could start, by already knowing what the next problem would be. The Third Army's advance through France in August 1944, the campaign that had Hitler muttering about the crazy cowboy general, moved at speeds the German assessment process could not keep pace with. By the time a German staff had identified Patton's axis of advance and issued orders to respond, Patton's lead elements were somewhere else. The response was always to yesterday's problem. This was not an accident. It was the operational expression of Patton's philosophy. The goal of movement was not to reach a destination. The goal of movement was to operate faster than the enemy's ability to react. An enemy who was always responding to what you had done could never respond to what you were doing. An enemy who could never respond to what you were doing could not stop you. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army in the Ardennes offensive, and whose forces were directly countered by Patton's relief of Bastogne, wrote after the war about what fighting Patton felt like from the German side. He described it as fighting a man who was always one decision ahead. Not more intelligent, not better equipped, one decision ahead. While the German staff was completing the assessment of the current situation, Patton had already made the decision about the next one. While the German units were moving to respond to the last Patton attack, Patton's forces were already in position for the next. Von Manteuffel had fought the Red Army on the Eastern Front. He had fought the British in North Africa. He described Patton as qualitatively different from any opponent he had faced. Not in the quality of the forces he commanded, but in the speed at which he operated at the command level. Patton never gave us time to think, von Manteuffel wrote later. He had commanded some of the finest formations in the Wehrmacht. He had fought Zhukov on the Eastern Front. He did not say this lightly. This was the most precise description of Patton's tactical philosophy that any of his opponents produced. Not, Patton was unpredictable. Not, Patton was reckless. Patton never gave us time to think. Because thinking, the assessment, the evaluation, the decision, was what the German system required to function. A German division without time to think was a division that could not respond coherently. A German army without time to think was always responding to the wrong threat, always late, always one step behind. This was what von Lüttwitz had encountered at Bastogne without understanding it. Nuts was not stubbornness, it was time. Every hour the 101st held Bastogne was an hour Patton's columns moved north. Every hour von Lüttwitz spent waiting for the Americans to recognize the logic of their situation was an hour Patton used. The Americans were not waiting. They were never waiting. German doctrine assumed a commander received orders, assessed the situation, then acted. This sequence had a minimum duration. Patton had eliminated it. Not by skipping the assessment, by doing it before the orders arrived. The contingency plans existed before Eisenhower gave the order. The routes were mapped before the conference in Verdun. When the order came, there was nothing to assess. There was only execution. One decision ahead, always. On December 22, 1944, von Lüttwitz was running out of time. He was tightening his encirclement of Bastogne, coordinating attacks from multiple directions, watching his artillery pound the town where the 101st Airborne was holding positions that any rational assessment indicated were untenable. He had sent the surrender ultimatum. He had received nuts. He had resumed the attack. His intelligence staff gave him an assessment that morning. American forces to the south were repositioning. The Third Army's orientation appeared to be changing. Patton's forces were beginning to move north. Von Lüttwitz read the assessment and made an estimate. 4 days, minimum, before Patton could constitute a significant threat. The weather was terrible. The roads were ice. The distances were enormous. The Third Army would need time to disengage, time to reorient, time to establish new supply lines. 4 days. He had 4 days to take Bastogne. He did not have 4 days. He had 2. The 4th Armored Division, Patton's spearhead, the unit he had chosen because it was the fastest, the most aggressive, was already 50 miles north of where it had been 48 hours earlier. The battalion commanders were driving through ice and darkness on roads mapped the week before, following routes plotted before the German attack had begun. The artillery was moving into positions identified before Patton left for Verdun. German armies moved when they received orders. Orders required assessments. Assessments required time. 4 days was the realistic estimate. Patton's army had been moving since the order that hadn't been given yet. Hitler had been furious about Patton's Brittany drive in August. German headquarters had identified it as a catastrophic overextension. The counterattack had failed, not because German forces were inadequate, but because by the time it was organized and launched, Patton had moved his army out of the corridor. He had not defended the vulnerability. He had moved past it before the Germans could exploit it. "Just look at that crazy cowboy general," Hitler had said, "driving down to the south along a single road and over a single bridge with an entire army. He doesn't care about the risk. It doesn't seem possible." Hitler had meant this as criticism. He had misread it. The single road was not recklessness. It was precision, the recognition that German forces would need time to close the corridor and that Patton would be through it before that time elapsed. Patton himself was not at headquarters. He was in a jeep, moving between corps and division commanders, personally ensuring the movement was happening at the speed he demanded. On December 20th, he visited 7 divisions and regrouped an army, driving from one command post to another in conditions that grounded aircraft and paralyzed lesser organizations. At the end of the day, his driver, Master Sergeant John Mims, said, "General, the government is wasting a lot of money hiring a whole general staff." The comment captured something real. The Third Army ran on Patton's personal tempo, his physical presence at critical points, his ability to make decisions that a headquarters would have spent hours processing. Every commander he visited understood not just the order, but the reason behind it. The sergeants of the Third Army were finding the way north, through the ice and dark and the worst winter in 50 years. At 4:50 on the afternoon of December 26th, Cobra King found Bastogne. Von Lüttwitz had had 4 days. He had used 2 of them waiting for the 101st to surrender. The remaining 2 had been used by Patton. This was the mathematics of tempo that German commanders could not account for, because their doctrine had no category for a commander who was spending time the enemy had not yet been allocated. Von Lüttwitz had calculated correctly that he had 4 days. He had calculated incorrectly that those 4 days would belong to him. Patton had been spending them since December 9th, before the attack had begun. Before the problem existed. The relief of Bastogne on December 26th did not end the Battle of the Bulge. It ended von Lüttwitz's plan. The German offensive had been designed around momentum, the assumption that the initial breakthrough would be exploited before the Allies could respond, that Bastogne would fall before it could be reinforced, that the Meuse River would be crossed before the Allied command recovered from the shock of the attack. Each element of the plan depended on the previous element succeeding on schedule. Bastogne had not fallen on schedule. The 101st Airborne had held for 8 days on nerve and improvisation and the specific, bloody stubbornness that American infantry had demonstrated in every theater of the war. They had held because they had been told to hold, and because they understood why holding mattered, and because Patton was coming. The relief corridor was narrow, barely a mile wide, contested on both sides by German forces that had not given up. Von Lüttwitz immediately ordered attacks to close it. The fighting continued for weeks, but the momentum was gone. German armor driving west had been stopped by terrain, weather, Allied air power, and the specific fact that a significant portion of von Lüttwitz's resources had to be redirected to deal with Patton's army now in his southern flank. The Third Army had not just relieved Bastogne, it had changed what the Germans had to think about. Von Manteuffel later wrote about the psychological effect of Patton's appearance on the southern flank. German commanders had been focused on the drive west, on Bastogne. They had not been focused on the south. The south was where Patton would be in 4 days. He was there in 2, with a force that immediately required attention. The 4th Armored hit the German southern flank before the Germans had organized a defense. This was the pattern. This was always the pattern. In Normandy, he had moved through Brittany before the Germans could close the corridor. In the Ardennes, he had relieved Bastogne before they organized against the threat from the south. In both cases, the German assessment had been professionally competent. In both cases, it had been wrong by the same factor. Patton moved faster than the German model said armies could move, not because his soldiers were faster or his vehicles were better, because the time German doctrine required for planning and assessment had been eliminated by a man who had spent 30 years thinking about how to eliminate it. The German model was not wrong. It was built on accurate observations of how military organizations functioned. Planning takes time. Coordination takes time. 100,000 men do not change direction without the expenditure of time. Patton had not violated this. He had moved the time expenditure to a point before the crisis, to the quiet week in December when Colonel Cook was tracking German radio traffic and Patton was ordering contingency plans for an offensive nobody else believed was coming. When the crisis arrived, the time had already been spent. There was only execution left. After the war, German officers interviewed by American historians, the German Report Series, hundreds of pages of professional assessments, were asked specifically about Patton. Their answers varied in detail. They agreed on the substance. He was always somewhere they had not prepared for. Not because he was unpredictable, because he arrived before they could prepare. The distinction seems small. It is not small. An unpredictable opponent might arrive anywhere, and a defender must defend everywhere. A fast opponent arrives before you can react, and a defender who cannot react in time is defeated, regardless of how well he has prepared. Patton was not unpredictable. He was faster than the response. That was what they had missed. Von Lüttwitz, in a post-war interview conducted by American historians in 1949, was asked what he would have done differently at Bastogne. He was quiet for a moment. "I would have taken the town in the first 2 days," he said, before Patton could turn. The interviewer noted that this had not been operationally possible given the American resistance. "No," von Lüttwitz agreed. "That is correct. It was not possible." He paused. "That is why we lost." The question that German commanders kept returning to after the war was not whether Patton was a good general. He was obviously a good general. The evidence was conclusive. The Third Army had moved from Normandy to the German border faster than any army in history. It had turned 90 degrees in the worst winter in 50 years and relieved a surrounded garrison in 48 hours. It had crossed the Rhine and driven deep into Germany in the final months of the war. The results were not in question. The question was what kind of good he was. German military culture had a precise vocabulary for excellence in command. There were generals who were gifted tacticians, who could read terrain and position forces and execute the specific moves that won engagements. There were generals who were gifted operational planners, who could coordinate multiple formations across large distances and achieve objectives that required weeks of preparation. There were generals who were gifted strategists, who understood the larger context and could see how individual battles contributed to the overall shape of the war. Patton did not fit cleanly into any of these categories, which was part of why German assessments of him were inconsistent. He was a gifted tactician, but his tactical decisions were often criticized as reckless. The single road through Brittany, the aggressive pursuit that outran his supply lines, the constant pressure on subordinates to move faster than they believed was safe. A tactician, by conventional definition, managed risk. Patton managed tempo. He was a gifted operational planner, but his planning process was unconventional. The contingency plans prepared weeks in advance, the pre-positioned logistics, the decision to accept the reality of a situation before it had officially arrived. A planner, by conventional definition, responded to orders. Patton responded to what he believed the orders would be. He was not a strategist in the traditional sense. He did not work at the level of grand strategic decision-making. He worked at the level of the army, with 3 corps and multiple divisions, and his strategic contribution was indirect. the specific effect on the enemy of being forced to respond to an opponent who operated faster than the response cycle allowed. What he was, in the vocabulary that German military culture had not developed because no German general had systematically done it, was a tempo commander. Not a commander who fought fast, a commander who made the enemy fight at the wrong speed. The distinction is critical. Fighting fast, moving your units quickly, attacking before the enemy is ready, is a tactical attribute. Any aggressive commander attempts it. Making the enemy fight at the wrong speed is something different. It requires not just moving your own forces quickly, but understanding the enemy's decision cycle, how long it takes them to assess a situation, evaluate options, issue orders, and execute, and operating consistently inside that cycle. Patton had studied the German army for 30 years. He had watched it in action in North Africa, in Sicily, in Normandy. He knew, not precisely but approximately, how long German staff work took. He knew the sequence: observe, assess, decide, order, execute. He knew that each step had a minimum duration, and that the duration was determined by the institutional culture of the organization, not by individual willpower. He also knew that his own organization's culture, built around his specific insistence on contingency planning and aggressive movement, operated faster than that minimum. Not because American soldiers were more capable than German soldiers, because Patton had spent 20 years training his staff and his subordinate commanders to compress the sequence, to assess while moving, to decide before the orders arrived, to execute before the situation had fully developed. Von Manteuffel had identified this without naming it. Patton never gave us time to think. What he had observed was that the German sequence, observe, assess, decide, order, execute, was being interrupted at the assessment stage. Before the German command could complete its assessment of the current situation, the situation had changed. Before the change could be assessed, it had changed again. The German staff was always assessing yesterday. Patton was always attacking tomorrow. Von Lüttwitz was captured in April 1945. The German army retreated. Not because it lacked courage, that had been documented in blood across 6 years of war, but because it could not stabilize a defense against a force that attacked before the defense could be organized. The Rhine crossing in March 1945 was the final demonstration. For 140 years, no foreign army had crossed the Rhine by force. The river was the last natural barrier protecting the German heartland, and the Germans had invested it with the significance of a line that would hold, not because it was militarily impregnable, but because the psychological cost of crossing it would stop any attacker. Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine on March 22, 1945. Not because Patton had found a weakness in the German defenses, because he had crossed before the defenses were fully organized. The same principle, always the same principle. Move before the enemy has time to prepare. Move before the defense can be coordinated. The 5th Infantry Division put boats in the water at 10:30 at night. The Germans on the eastern bank had pre-registered artillery on the likely crossing points. Standard doctrine was to suppress the defenders with artillery first. Patton did not suppress first. He crossed first. The artillery pre-registration was irrelevant if the target was already across. He called Bradley the next morning. "Don't tell anyone, but I've crossed the Rhine." He paused. "I sneaked across last night." By the time the German artillery had been told where to fire, Patton's infantry was across. The war ended in May. Von Lüttwitz spent 2 years in captivity, cooperating with the American historians who were systematically interviewing German generals as part of the effort to understand what had happened. He engaged with the interviews professionally, the dispositions, the timelines, the decisions made and unmade. He did not excuse his failures. He analyzed them. In 1949, he gave his final interview on the subject. He was asked what made Patton different. Von Lüttwitz thought about this for a long time. "We were taught that a commander who understood the situation could control the battle," he said finally. "We were correct about this. A commander who understands the situation can control the battle." He paused. Patton understood the situation before the situation existed. He had been thinking about Bastogne for 4 years. The intelligence assessment on December 22nd that had given him 4 days. The 2 days he had spent waiting for McAuliffe to recognize reality, while Patton spent those same 2 days doing something his assessment had told him Patton could not yet be doing. We calculated that he needed 4 days, von Lüttwitz said. We calculated correctly. He did need 4 days. He had spent them the week before. This was the most precise analysis any German officer produced of what Patton had done to them. Not that Patton had been faster, that Patton had been earlier. He had not operated inside the German decision cycle by moving his forces more quickly. He had operated inside it by making his decisions before the cycle began. By the time von Lüttwitz's intelligence staff was calculating how long Patton would need, Patton had already decided. By the time the calculation was complete, the decision was executed. By the time the execution was observed and assessed, Patton was somewhere else. A good plan, Patton had said many times, violently executed now, is better than a perfect plan next week. The Germans were still working on the perfect plan. The German staff was always assessing yesterday. Patton was always already somewhere else. This was what German generals had called unpredictable. It was not unpredictable. It was simply faster than they could see. Von Lüttwitz returned to West Germany after his release. He died in 1969. He had been a professional soldier for 40 years, fought in 2 world wars, commanded armor on the Eastern Front, led one of the most ambitious German offensives of the Western Campaign. He had been defeated by a man who had already done what von Lüttwitz assumed he hadn't started. There was no satisfying answer to how. You cannot defend against a commander who has already made his move before you know the game has started. George Patton died on December 21st, 1945. Not in combat. Not in the war he had spent his entire life preparing for and had fought with everything he possessed. He died in a car accident in Mannheim, Germany, 12 days after being injured when his staff car collided with an army truck on a road outside the city. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He died of pulmonary edema in a military hospital. He was 60 years old. His last letter from the hospital: "This is a hell of a way to die." He was right about that. He had wanted to die in the last cavalry charge, or in the command tank of the last armored offensive, shot through the head by the last bullet of the last battle. He had wanted to die in motion, moving towards something, faster than the enemy expected, one decision ahead. He died in a hospital bed, 12 days after a traffic accident, 2 months after the war ended. The war he had fought produced results that any professional assessment would call decisive. From August 1944 to May 1945, 281 days, the Third Army advanced over 1,000 miles, captured 81,500 square miles of territory, took 1.28 million prisoners, and inflicted over 1.4 million casualties on German forces. These numbers are in the official histories. They do not capture what the numbers represented. What they represented was a theory about war that had started in Mexico in 1916 with 3 automobiles and 10 men, had been refined through 1918 and North Africa and Normandy and Bastogne and the Rhine, and had been proven comprehensively and beyond reasonable argument correct. Speed was a weapon, not a tactic, a weapon. The weapon that, properly applied, made every other weapon more effective. The weapon that took the enemy's strengths and made them irrelevant by acting before the strengths could be deployed. The weapon that took the enemy's plans and made them obsolete by executing before the plans could be implemented. The German generals who had faced Patton had been trained in the finest military tradition in Europe. They had read Clausewitz and Moltke. They had absorbed the lessons of the military culture that produced the most effective fighting force of the 20th century. They had been unprepared for a man who had spent 30 years thinking about one thing. Speed was the weapon. The idea was old. The cavalry had been built on it. What Patton had done was systematic, thought through every implication, trained every subordinate, built the institutional culture that made the idea operational at the scale of a modern army. He made speed not an individual attribute, but an organizational one. a thing the Third Army did not because its commander was bold, but because its commander had spent 20 years making boldness institutional. This was why Brandenberger's estimate of 4 days was wrong. Not because Brandenberger was wrong about how armies moved. He was right about how armies moved. He was wrong about how this army moved. Because this army had been built by a man who had decided, 30 years earlier, that the standard speed of military decision-making was too slow, and who had spent those 30 years eliminating every unnecessary step in the sequence. Observe, assess, decide, order, execute. Patton had moved the first 3 steps to before the problem arrived. By December 9th, he had observed. By December 10th, he had assessed. By December 12th, he had decided. On December 19th, when Eisenhower asked how long it would take, Patton said 48 hours. He was not promising what he would do. He was reporting what was already happening. The code word had been given. The divisions were moving. The routes had been mapped, supply lines plotted, artillery positions identified. The conference at Verdun was not the moment of decision. The moment of decision had been December 9th, when Colonel Koch showed Patton the German radio intercepts, and Patton ordered his staff to prepare for what nobody else believed was coming. From Mexico in 1916 to the Rhine in 1945, the principle never changed. Move before the enemy can prepare. Execute before the enemy can react. A good plan, violently executed now, is better than a perfect plan next week. The Germans were always working on the perfect plan. Patton was always already gone. The principle did not die with Patton. It could not die with Patton because it was not Patton's invention. It was a discovery, a specific truth about how military time works and about what happens to an organization that consistently operates inside its opponent's decision cycle. The United States Army formalized what he had done into doctrine. The OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, was developed by Air Force Colonel John Boyd in the 1970s, partly from the study of what had worked in the Second World War. What Boyd's loop described was precisely the mechanism von Manteuffel had identified. Patton never gave us time to think. The goal was not to act faster. The goal was to cycle faster, to complete the loop faster than the enemy, so that by the time the enemy had completed his cycle and was ready to act, your next cycle had already changed the situation he was acting on. This was what Patton had done, not theoretically, operationally, in the mud and ice of December 1944, with 133,000 vehicles turning 90 degrees in the worst winter in 50 years. The air-land battle doctrine that proved decisive in Desert Storm in 1991, American armored forces sweeping around the Iraqi flank in 100 hours, contained at its core the same principle Patton had applied at Bastogne. Desert Storm's ground campaign lasted 100 hours. The Iraqi army was prepared for a frontal assault. The assault came from a direction it had not fully prepared for, moving faster than its decision cycle could process. The commanders who planned Desert Storm had studied the Third Army's campaign in France. They had built the institutional culture that made speed not a property of individual commanders, but of the organization itself. The principle that Patton had developed from Mexico through World War I, through North Africa, through Normandy, that the cavalry's purpose was not the horse but the speed, not the charge but the arrival before the defense was ready, had become the organizing principle of American armored warfare. It is still the organizing principle. Every American armor officer trained today learns Boyd's OODA loop. Every American ground commander is taught to seek positions inside the enemy's decision cycle. Every doctrine document that describes how American forces should fight contains in its DNA the idea that Patton applied in Belgium in December 1944. Move before the enemy can prepare. Execute before the enemy can react. The German staff is always assessing yesterday. You should always be attacking tomorrow. Von Lüttwitz had asked what he would have done differently. Nothing. The flaw was not in the plan. The flaw was in the assumption that the plan would have time to work. Patton had already taken that time. December 9th, 1944. A quiet room in Nancy. Colonel Koch and the radio intercepts. When the army that would relieve Bastogne began, in the only way that mattered, to move, von Lüttwitz called Patton unpredictable. He was completely predictable. He always did the fastest thing. Not the boldest, not the most dramatic, the fastest. The thing that would arrive before the enemy could respond. The thing that the enemy's assessment said was not yet possible. The thing that, by the time it was acknowledged as possible, had already happened. From 3 automobiles in Mexico in 1916 to 133,000 vehicles in Belgium in December 1944, Patton had been winning the contest of time. German generals called it unpredictable. It was the most predictable thing in the world. He was always already gone.